Some themes and speakers have appeal across disciplinary boundaries. They really speak to the issues of the day in the social sciences. And the AISSR lecture series is a platform for these types of lectures, a place to discuss fundamental questions for all social sciences.
I'm going to do, I think, a little bit more of a framing talk. So going over some themes from this book I wrote called Invisible Rulers, which ties together how influence and propaganda work, drawing on about 5 years of work that I did when I was at Stanford Internet Observatory. I don't know how many people here are familiar with what happened to Stanford Internet Observatory, but that'll be part of the talk as well. And I'm going to try to touch on the big overarching themes of what is happening with democracy as a function of a new kind of triad, influencers, algorithms, and crowds that increasingly shape public opinion. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the response to the work, and then I can talk a little bit about why I'm at Georgetown. So I guess just to start with a quick frame, I would argue that there are three main things that social media has done to transform democracy. And this is not necessarily to say that they are all necessarily bad. I think that we've seen a rewiring in legitimacy, who is considered to be an authoritative speaker, who is considered to be an expert, and we'll talk a little bit about why and how that rewiring of legitimacy happened. We'll talk a little bit about rewarding extremes. Extremophiles is the term that The Atlantic came up with. I think it's a very good one. Why certain types of influencers speak in particular types of ways, how audience capture directs factions online to behave in particular types of ways, and just what the incentive and reward structure has done to transform democratic discourse. Again, recognizing that this can also be used for good, but it does, my work is focused on adversarial abuse, so I do tend to focus more on the negative. And then finally, reality fragmentation. What happens when you have a rise of factions and a series of dynamics that social media leads to, that lead people to find themselves in very different, very distinct information environments, and what happens when that begins to impact cohesion, when people begin to trust foundationally different information sources that are telling them completely different things about the world, and what happens, what impact that has on democracy. So essentially, we're going to be talking about the dynamics, the sort of foundations of political credibility, and how they have changed. And I'm going to start with an example that audiences in the United States know immediately. And just a quick show of hands, how many people are familiar with the phrase, "they're eating the pets"? Okay, so that made it over here. Great. So I don't know how many people are familiar with the mechanics of how "they're eating the pets" happened, but we'll go through that very, very quickly, because I think it's a fantastic example of how discourse on social media impacts political opinion shaping today. So this was a post from a Springfield, Ohio crime watch group. This is a thing that you see them. They're quite common in the US. This is a private group. So in order to join these groups, you actually usually have to prove that you're a resident of the community. People really know each other, and they go in there and they post in a closed private group things that are of concern to them in their communities. So this person here, whose name I've redacted, went in and posted about how her neighbor's friend's daughter's cat went missing, and was, this person posts this warning, this very sincere warning. She sincerely believes this, and I think it's very important to understand that. Sincerely believes that the Haitians in the community, there's been a kind of a resettlement, refugee assistance program, that these Haitians who are living in her community now have been eating the pets. So what happens next? Well, that post is decontextualized. It is posted to Twitter. And on Twitter, the person who picks it up says, "See, I told you they were eating the ducks. I told you that they were eating the ducks." This person's saying they're eating the cats. They are eating the pets. And what happens when something lands on Twitter? There's a phrase that Dana Boyd uses, context collapse. I imagine many of you here are familiar with it. All of a sudden, you have a post that has been taken out of the environment in which it was created for, and it is now out there on Twitter, and this becomes a wildly viral post. And what you start to see is a term that we use in, I guess, I don't know that I necessarily consider myself communications, but participatory propaganda, right? Where the audience is really actively very, very involved in shaping the discourse around this thing. So you've actually just had like the launch of Grok on Twitter as an image creator, and people begin to go and they begin to create political propaganda. And I don't use that term as a pejorative, I use it in the sense of information with an agenda, and people are out there, they're participating. They find this fascinating. This is during a presidential election, Donald Trump is running for president, so all of a sudden you have the cats and the ducks, and people are producing this content. And it really runs the gamut from the funny to the racist to the sort of weirdly militant, or whatever you call that last one over there with the rifle cat. But you can see up at the top there, Donald Trump goes and actually picks up that meme and he shares it to Truth Social. One of the things that you see happening very, very often among Donald Trump's political movement, the MAGA movement that began way back in 2016, so over a decade now, almost a decade now, is that they are constantly pulling up content created by the crowd, constantly taking content that their fans have made. It's a very kind of fandom type relationship where they see this content and they see it as an opportunity to advance the content created by their people. This provides a lot of joy, a lot of happiness, a lot of engagement from the people who are creating this content, because maybe you never know, the President of the United States or the aspiring President of the United States is going to pick up your content and share it. There's a real incentive to participate there. So this stuff goes viral on Twitter. I think I should also mention that it's very fun for the participants. But what happens next? Well, J.D. Vance, who's now our vice president, at the time is the senator from Ohio where these stories are taking place. And what J.D. Vance does, you can see the dates down there, September 9th and 10th. You can also see the view counts, 11.5 million, 15 million impressions. Half of those are probably bots, but you never know. What you see there is, rather than saying this is all nonsense, right? What he says is, I told people that this was happening. I told people that we really have to be looking out for this. Where is our border czar? Where is Kamala Harris? Right, and that's because Kamala Harris was the vice president at the time, ostensibly responsible for the border. And so he takes this viral social media moment and he takes it from being sort of a rumor, sort of a meme, something fun that is happening, and he begins to make it a very serious issue. He anchors it to the issue of immigration, and we begin to have very much a bigger story here. This is a story about who is America for, who are the resources of this community for, why aren't people hearing the plight of these people? And again, keep in mind that this is coming from the vice presidential candidate for the candidate for the vice presidency, and more importantly, the senator from Ohio. This is a credible voice. This is not an online whack job. This is not an influencer. This is a respected political elite, right? And so all of a sudden we have a person who is a man with a massive megaphone who takes this story and makes it a national news story. So what happens next? Sorry, my clicker is, there we go. Well, what happens next is the presidential debate. I was in an airport that night, and I was sitting at the airport bar waiting for my, on a layover, waiting for my flight. And this debate is happening, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And he says it. He says they're eating the pets on the debate stage. And I am extremely online. I knew exactly what this was, but I'm looking at the people around me, and they're looking at each other, and they're thinking, like, what the hell is going on? All right, and because it sounds crazy, it sounds absolutely insane if you don't spend your time on Twitter. And actually, we could see in Google search results, you see this spike, eating the pets, right? People are out there searching, trying to figure out what, again, the person who'd been the president of the United States and is running again, what he's searching for. So this becomes a meme now on the left, where you have this audio clip of the president saying they're eating the cats. That's a guy, sorry, my lousy recall, jet lag. He makes a lot of like these kind of cool sounding board reggae remixes, and so he turns this into a sound on TikTok. And you start to have like dance, there's like a dance trend to they're eating the pets. And so this becomes something where you start to see it move almost in the favor of the left, which realizes that ridicule is a very effective kind of counter strategy. That's the direction that it goes. But ultimately, that's inconvenient for the right, which wants to reclaim this because it has been such an engaging thing for their base. And again, keep in mind, they are using it to tell a bigger story about immigration and who belongs. For them, it is a propaganda narrative. And so you have Chris Rufo, who's a very influential figure in the US, and he puts out this call, says $5,000 bounty for anybody who goes and finds me evidence of the Haitians eating the pets. So now we've had, by this point, almost 10 days of news cycle at September 14th of eating the pets. And now they want the evidence to support the thing that the vice president and the president have both already said. So now we have the calls for the evidence. That grainy video, which somebody finds by looking through old Facebook posts, this is not new evidence, becomes another part of the news cycle where there are literally people who are zooming in on the ankles of the animals on that grill, trying to figure out if they are bird or mammal. So meanwhile, you have then influencers and media that descend upon Springfield, trying to figure out, again, what is the truth of the matter here. And where we wind up is with J.D. Vance essentially saying he is willing to stick by the stories that he has created, even if they are not actually real. This is kind of an incredible admission from a major politician, right? This is somebody basically saying, like, yes, I made it up, and what, right? Yes, there's no truth to it, but so what? If you're creating a bigger story, you have the opportunity to shape public opinion, and this is what we're doing here. But the problem is the online stories, I'm trying to click without advancing too much, the online stories don't stay online. And there's some pretty profound real world impacts that happen as a result of this, like bombs being called in to schools, death threats for the Republican, by the way, Ohio businessman who made some media commentary talking about the Haitians who were working in his factories, right? And the governor is a Republican. He's out there saying this isn't happening. They're trying to diffuse the situation, even as it is politically advantageous for the presidential campaign, and so it continues to run with it. So what is happening here? You know, when this was happening, it was described in the media as an online conspiracy theory, which it is, but I think that the problem with using that terminology is that it makes it sound like something that's very easy to dismiss, right? It's something some nutty people online, some conspiracy theorists, and I would argue that this is actually reflective of something that's much bigger. It's an online rumor spread via a new power triad of influencers, algorithms, and online crowds, and they move information in ways that are very much resistant to correction from mass media, from the targets, right? Again, no matter how many times the very authoritative Republican governor or the media were out there saying this isn't happening, it doesn't correct the record. It doesn't change people's point of view. They are really invested in this. Polling showed that approximately 55% of the president's supporters believed that this was real. So that's a smaller percentage when you view it in the entirety of the American polity, but a very significant percentage of the president's supporters believed that this was something that was real. And one of the reasons that this is happening is that oftentimes the members of the online factions don't trust anything outside of their particular media ecosystem, their particular influencer ecosystem, or their small network. So the book that I wrote argues that we're living in an interesting time where you have two different ways of making sense of the world that have kind of come into the same physical infrastructure, right? So you have the rumor mill meeting the propaganda machine. Both of these were, or are, ways of shaping public opinion that kind of collide within the current technological infrastructure. So in communication theory, rumors are unverified, unofficial pieces of information or stories that circulate from person to person. The unverified and unofficial are the two really important words in that sentence because they're often a response to, by deeply distrustful communities that just don't believe the official narrative. They're just saying, no, 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 that's not true. What I share, what I know, what I believe, what I decide in conjunction with my friends and with my community, that's what's real. Whatever the media is telling me, that's not. So when you have a rumor, everybody here has passed a rumor or shared a rumor at some point in their life because it's compelling, it's exciting, it makes you feel like you have secret knowledge, makes you feel like you know something, and more importantly, it's very pro-social. You feel like you're informing your community about a thing that is happening. Interestingly, just to close the loop on the eating the pets, that original woman who posted that thing in the Springfield board, that cat was found. The Wall Street Journal wrote an article about that cat getting found, and she apologized, right? She was mortified by what she had kicked off. But by that point, that didn't matter either. Her apology wasn't received as like, whoops, I got it wrong, no cats are being eaten here. It just kind of like moved right under the radar. It was in the Wall Street Journal, but it wasn't picked up in the same communities that were doing the rumor spreading. And then you have propaganda. which I like the sort of Jowett definition, but we'll use this one for now, which is information with an agenda designed to further the intent of its creator. I personally think we should be using a more expansive version of the term, because I personally think, and I make this argument in slightly different versions of the talk, that misinformation and disinformation are the wrong ways to think about this, and that actually what we are seeing now is a lot of very powerful people who have recognized that sharing information, creating stories, is an incredibly potent way to create relationships between the policies and the kind of power dynamics that they want to see in the world, and the very direct way of engagement, the participatory dynamics that they have with their audiences. I think that this is much more the correct way to be thinking about this. It's not misinformation that people are eating the pets, right? This is what is actually happening there. So all of this plays out on an information ecosystem, and we are the glue between all of these platforms. So something starts on one platform, but it is individual people who move content from one platform to another. This is something that I think actually gets neglected when we talk about how social media infrastructure operates, because in aggregate, this forms an ecosystem, and it is the users that create the bridges across the ecosystem. So a lot of the time you'll hear talk about the algorithm or the influencer, but that's sort of specific to one vertical, and it is actually the users and the participants, the ordinary people, who pick content up from one platform and move it to another, and who are really helping to provide that glue and that continuity and to spread that content from one platform to another. And so this is, I think, a way of users spanning that ecosystem is very, very important. And there we go, okay. So today's platforms don't just reflect reality, right? There's this idea of social media as some sort of democratic mirror, and the point that I want to make through the next section of this talk is that that's actually a very, in my opinion, naive way of looking at it. It's much more of a machine than a mirror. They're really actively shaping how people engage and what people do. So instead of thinking about the influencer or the algorithm, or the crowd always gets neglected, instead of thinking about these things as separately, you have to think of them as a complex system. None of these things operates without the other. Each of these things, the incentives for the behavior, the incentives for the type of content that is created, the way that we speak is shaped by what the algorithm will reward. I don't know if you guys have seen or heard of the book Algo Speak, but it's fantastic, right? Ways in which you'll see even teenagers saying words like unalived, right? Because they know that certain words will be downranked by algorithms, because that is just how information is mediated. So the relationship between these three things is such that the influencer is constantly creating content not only for the human audience, but for the algorithmic curator. The algorithmic curator is taking signal from the crowd, from the early audience. It's also really shaping what the influencer is producing. If you talk to influencers, and I talk to them actually a fair bit at this point, what they will tell you is they're in there looking at, does my thumbnail, A/B testing their thumbnail. They're constantly A/B testing the title of their video. They're looking at how many seconds people are watching before they click away, right? What is the title that is most useful? What is the tone? Is the tone of moral indignation, moral righteousness? It turns out the algorithm loves that, which is why you see so much of this tone of rage almost that comes out in the content, particularly political content. But this relationship holds no matter what the type of content we're talking about is. There is no way for an influencer to be creating content just for the crowd, because even if you are following a social media account, when a feed is curated and ranked, the ranking algorithm is deciding from all of the different things it has available to show you at a given moment what to push out. And so again, even if you have that following relationship happening, you're not necessarily going to be seeing those posts. A lot of people think, oh, well, we'll just switch to reverse chronological order. But then the incentive that creates is for the influencer to be constantly posting, right? To be almost spamming so that their content continues to get seen. And so the relationship between these three things, the book really goes into these three things essentially as a complex system. You cannot have one without the other. When you read articles saying, like, if only the algorithm was different, it really misses the human component of that. When there are articles arguing that the influencer just needs to change their behavior or do something differently or be more responsible, it sort of neglects the understanding of what that audience relationship does to motivate, the phenomenon of audience capture in particular, or the fact that in order to earn a living, the influencer is dependent on the algorithm. And so the phrase that, this comes from Charlie Munger in Business in the United States, but you'll see this in basically any like B School 101 class. Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome, right? And basically, in the very, very old, even propaganda literature, which I draw on very heavily when I'm writing about these things. Noam Chomsky was writing about propaganda in the context of, in the book Manufacturing Consent. If you think about the 5 filter model that Chomsky articulates in that book, where he's talking about media creating, writing, this is at the time of broadcast media, so news, television, he's talking about the incentives of the advertiser shaping coverage, the incentives of the audience that the media wants to reach shaping coverage. We've known this for a very long time. It is a book about, Manufacturing Consent is a book about incentives and the incentives that shape propaganda. And so when we think about the ecosystem today, it's that triad of 3 things that can't be disentangled and these sort of individual incentives for each one intersecting that gets us to where we are. So let's talk a little bit about the legitimacy rewired component. One of the ways, one of the things that happens on social media, the sort of be-all, end-all goal for many influencers is virality, right? And virality, it's an interesting term because we say the phrase, it went viral, which is a very passive construction. It didn't go viral. A lot of people simultaneously clicked a button, right? It went viral is a crowd activating around content or a concept, and that is what makes something go viral. So the thing that is interesting about this is that when I talk about legitimacy being rewired, the ideas that spread are the things that make people feel compelled to share. If you think back to Eating the Pets, that really weird sort of almost absurdist idea of people eating ducks made a whole lot of people decide to go hit that retweet button, to go hit that, to go over to Grok and make their own image of the president rescuing some ducks, right? These are the things that, and when that goes viral and it hits the trending, the trending feed where an algorithm is pushing it out to more people, capturing your attention with it, it is not the quiet expertise that says, no, let me tell you about the statistics around immigration in Springfield that is going to reach people. It is this phenomenon of what is it, who is it that is creating a message or speaking in a certain way or framing a conversation in a particular way that motivates the audience to participate, whether that's through the co-creation of content and the co-creation of a narrative or simply turning them into amplifiers. I only have half an hour, so this is a little faster than I normally go. One of the phrases, I got into this in part as a mom. My background's not actually in social science at all. I was in kind of quantitative, I was doing a lot of network analysis of the anti-vaccine movement back in the day as a mom who was really irritated by it, right? Who just said, like, why are they so much better at this than the CDC? Why are they so much better at this than the medical establishment? And the answer was, when the things that were going viral and trending on Twitter, in 2015 we had a measles outbreak in Disneyland, and social media was completely dominated by the anti-vaccine movement. And the stories of, do vaccines cause autism, all these different themes, all these different, the messages that reached people, the things that were going viral, the things that were hitting people's feeds, the things that were shaping public opinion about the public health response to that were all driven by the anti-vaccine movement, by anti-vaccine influencers. There was no such thing as a pro-vaccine influencer, because nobody in that legitimacy community, nobody, no credentialed doctor, no credentialed public health official thought, hey, I should be on Twitter communicating with the people where they are. No, 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 they were putting fact sheets up on the CDC website. They were giving quotes to the mass media. And so all of the things that are trending about the measles outbreak, about the bill, about what we were trying to do in California to respond to it. And again, I was just a very angry mom, with kids in school in daycare in California saying like, okay, come on, what do we do to push back against this? And people at the CDC, because they invited me down to give a talk about what we tried to do to create a parent-based counter movement, when I was like, why aren't you guys in the conversation? Their response to me was like, oh, those are just some people online, right? And so this idea of who is legitimate, who enjoys legitimacy, it is increasingly not the people who are the credentialed experts, it's the people who draw the audience in, make them feel like they're being heard, and make them feel like they're actually active participants in the conversation. And that's because, again, this is not a new concept at all. You'll hear it in advertising all the time. It's where the term influencer comes from, right? It comes from marketing. Attention is power. And when people begin to realize that you can capture attention on social media, use it as a tool for power, use it as a tool for movement building, that's where you start to see that really fundamental shift in who enjoys legitimacy and how the ability to communicate in certain ways really begins to change and to power that. Click. There we go. Rewarding extremity, how do we get to that point? So one of the things that starts to happen, and this happens in particular on Twitter, is the rise of, the term I use is factions. How many people are vaguely familiar with like the political meaning behind the emoji in this picture? One or two who are, I know you're very familiar with US politics. Yeah. So these are emoji, and I don't know to what extent this happens in European political dynamics, but in the US it became very common for people to just self-identify as members of particular political sub-communities by throwing an emoji in their bio on Twitter. And what that indicated was that the minute you saw the person in your replies, you could basically tell who they were. They were sort of telegraphing their membership in a very particular political community, and you could immediately identify them based on their emoji. So the rose was the Democratic Socialists, watermelon is actually used for the kind of Palestinian cause now, the bikes were the transit people, the avocado references a particular debate about housing costs in the United States. There was a guy who once said, like, if the kids were just stop eating avocado toast, they'd be able to afford housing. And so a lot of young people threw the avocados up in their bio, and that was where you would have the housing cost. People who were very passionate, the YIMBY movement, what we call it in the US, now sometimes called the abundance movement, but the abundance doesn't really associate quite so tightly with the avocado. But anyway, what was interesting about it is that you do just see these people would just kind of like form these communities, and you could kind of tell who your people were based on this form of signaling. And what was very interesting about it also was that you would occasionally say something that would piss off one of these people with one of these emojis in bio, and then the entire horde would descend, right? And so it became this really interesting phenomenon of how do people begin to use networked social media factions, not only to amplify their own message, but really to very actively fight with other factions, because that conflict becomes something that will occasionally hit trends, right? If people are fighting about something, that will draw attention to it, that will draw people in, that will motivate them, they will want to participate. Also, another thing that you start to see is the rising trend of the most extreme voices within the factions begins to become the thing that is most visible. I think Peter Thornburg writes about this, Jay Baxter does. There's a couple people, again, this is not a social science paper specific talk, but there's a lot of people who do great work basically making the point that the most extreme voices really come to dominate some of these factions, and those viewpoints come to be seen as emblematic of the faction. And so that's how you start to see even more kind of further distancing, where people begin to believe that for example, the average Democrat has a particularly extreme belief about defunding the police, which is a thing that becomes a bit of an online war in the US, or you can pick whichever political issue it is, but you start to see that dynamic happening. what starts to happen a little bit later is actually the rise and splintering of these factions onto completely different platforms. And so you start to see a rise of platforms catering to the left versus a rise of platforms catering to the right. So even further moving apart, and what is very interesting, if you do social science research, completely different things trend on these platforms, completely different topics dominate the topic of conversation. So when you think from a standpoint of democracy and cohesion, what are people talking about? What do they think are important issues? What do they think their fellow citizens believe? Where do you have consensus? What you see is even further division as people physically, virtually relocate to distinct spaces and begin to spend time on alternate platforms. This is a thing I talk about a lot more in the context of like content moderation and the speech wars online, but it becomes a very real dynamic. And then that leads into reality fragmentation. As people begin to become even more insular, they see less and less of the dynamics of what is happening, less and less of the debate and discussion and alternate viewpoints depending on where they spend their time. So when you have that happen, again, the phenomenon that people talk about, the sort of challenges, the information challenges on social media, I already said I think misinformation is just the wrong frame. I just think it's, I know that that is not necessarily a popular viewpoint, but I think that misinformation implies that if you were to correct people, they receive the information and then they change their mind. And after 10 years of looking at the efforts to do that, particularly around the anti-vaccine movement, that is just not it is just not speaking to what people are looking for. They see this, a lot of the information is tied up so closely in identity. It's tied up so closely in faction. It's tied up so closely in activism, activation, and behavior. And that's why I think propaganda is so much more the appropriate way of thinking about what is happening. And the other reason why I think viral rumors is particularly important is that when you do have that groundswell, when you do have those things like the woman in Springfield who very sincerely believes the situation with the cat, that is where, again, she has been primed to believe that her Haitian neighbors might be eating cats, right? There's could have a whole discussion about that by itself. But, and I'm going to show a slide, I think, actually get to it in a minute, about election rumors, which becomes a really potent thing in the United States. People are primed to believe certain things, and that shapes how they choose to interpret certain facts and events that happen in their lives, right? This is, again, the top-down, bottom-up intersection of propaganda and rumors. But so much of what happens is that people who believe a thing to be plausible then, in turn, see a situation happen, take that information, and begin to move the narrative through the faction and to kind of interpret it amongst themselves. And I want to make sure I have enough time to get to examples. So I would say for this, basically, again, when we talk only about the algorithm, the idea, one of the challenges is this question of who bears responsibility. And when we think about incentives, again, there's a lot of focus on the algorithm, but there is also something happening where people do increasingly have the power to self-select into a lot of groups and to really actively curate themselves into communities. And so I think that when we only focus on the technological, we are also missing the sincere desire that an increasing number of people have to be in these communities that reinforce what they already believe. And so the book spends a bit of time on why that is. So I want to talk now about some specific examples where we've seen this play out. And I'll talk briefly about how we look at these sorts of things in the context of the election. So this was work that we did. The logo down there at the bottom is the Election Integrity Partnership. I'll talk about how that imploded. But this is a graph made by Kate Starbird's team at University of Washington. They and at the time I was at Stanford Internet Observatory, we did this project looking at election rumors. And again, we went into the project thinking two things. One, that we would see a lot of stuff driven by state actors. We would see a lot of disinformation campaigns. That turned out not to be the case. Most of the stuff that moved in the US 2020 election came because audiences were primed by the President of the United States to believe that the election was going to be stolen. Within that frame, They looked at specific things that happened in the context of the election. In this particular case, I don't know how many people know what Sharpiegate was, but they began to believe that Sharpie markers in Maricopa County, Arizona had been given out only to Trump supporters because they believed that they were bleeding through the ballots, right? They believed that the bleed through rendered the ballot unreadable, which they believed meant that their ballots were not being counted. Arizona went for Joe Biden. This was a surprise. And when the MAGA movement was looking for some kind of justification as to how the election might have been stolen, because again, they were operating within the frame passed from the top down that it was going to be stolen if Trump lost, they returned to this idea that Sharpie markers in Maricopa County were one of the means by which this could have happened. And so we were looking at how does that happen? Well, you see down on the bottom there, the sort of chatter from people in Maricopa County, and I'll show the actual tweets, some of the tweets here, where what they're saying, and I redacted the ordinary person who posted this, my vote says canceled, I voted in person last night, they made me use a Sharpie and it bled through completely. This is voter fraud. And so you see people, she doesn't understand what's happening here, which is her mail-in ballot was canceled. That is a thing that the voter board shows that says your mail-in ballot was canceled because you voted in person. That is actually supposed to happen. You can't vote twice. So one ballot is being canceled because you voted in person. But this is quote unquote evidence. And you see a lot of these, what we call evidence collages that get assembled where people who, again, they have a sincere belief that the election has been stolen and they have been disenfranchised. You see the Maricopa County Elections Department trying to kind of put out the fire here. This winds up happening for them again in 2022. And then you have the political influencers who are saying, just asking questions. They're just asking questions. And the sort of inflection point happens when, again, much like J.D. Vance picking up the cat rumor lights it on fire, you have political influencers who pick up these rumors that are chatter among the base, and then they say, big if true, and that happens over and over and over again. And so the work that we did in 2020, again, we thought that we would see a lot of foreign interference, we thought that we would see a lot of things coming in from outside that were just brazenly inauthentic, and that's not what we saw at all. We saw rumors being picked up and lifted up as propaganda, and we saw that machine moving over and over and over again, and that is what ultimately leads to the Stop the Steal movement, because again, people very, very sincerely believe this, and the political elites at the top and the influencers amplify it at every step of the way. They do not step in and say, no, this isn't true, no, this didn't happen. In 2024, you start to see that dynamic happen on the left. But the interesting difference on the left is that the political elites do not pick it up. You do not see at any point, even as there are rumors about Starlink, even as there are rumors about ballot machines in Wisconsin not being properly loaded, and maybe this is why Kamala Harris lost, you never see the political elites or the massive influencers on the left pick that stuff up and boost it. So the rumor mill kicks off, the distrust is there, the belief that the election has been stolen by Trump happens, right? That deep distrust and polarization has hit both sides, so to speak, but you don't ever see that mass amplification and that mass buy-in because the political elites on the left and the influencers on the left have not gotten there. And that's where you see that really interesting gate continue to happen, where the influencer is the thing that sends it kind of stratospheric. We were also looking at this in the context of vaccines. I felt like I should pull at least one European example. And I know that in Amsterdam, I think you all had the 5G tower burning. We were looking at this in the US too. And again, you see that same phenomenon of, do you trust the official narrative or do you trust the sort of rumors that begin to move through the bottom, that move through the health and wellness influencers, the COVID influencers, and that dynamic happens again. In the US now, so now we're looking at some 2025 stuff. One of the things that is very interesting, and when I wrote the first edition of the book, which came out in late 2024, the new edition will be out early next year. I just turned in my epilogue. What's interesting now is that the institutions themselves are are now part of the machine, right? So you see, whereas previously a lot of what I was writing about was how does the institution counter-speak against these dynamics, now what you're starting to see is individuals being run by appointees that actually use the rumor mill from the base to justify actions they want to take to implement policy. So we have even a further carry through of what is happening, the sort of online social media chatter, where actually for example, the effort to dismantle USAID, you start to see ordinary people going through USAID grant databases that have been public for the entirety of the existence of the organization. But all of a sudden they begin to make accusations. They begin to find grant numbers. They begin to find grantees, and they do not fully understand what it is they're looking at in many cases, and so these rumors go viral. There's one, I don't know if you heard this headline, $50 million in condoms for Hamas. Did that one make it over here? Yes, there you go. So this, of course, is not a real thing. But again, that same dynamic of people get very, very mad about it online, and Elon says, you know, we got it, we canceled that, we destroyed that, we sent it through the wood chipper, right? And so all of a sudden, the continuity is happening all the way up through the governance and policy process now. And people, when you study the response of the crowd as this is happening, they are so excited about the fact, because again, they sincerely believe what they are seeing. They sincerely believe that what they are doing is like finding this evidence of corruption and waste and fraud. And so what they're saying is like, finally people are listening to us. Finally the government is responsive. Finally people are doing things in response to what we're saying. So they see this as a government is finally responding to us for the first time. They feel incredibly empowered by it, and it really begins to become a thing that for months, for a solid 2 months at the start of the administration, they begin to look for this in all of these different types of, all of these different agencies, all of these different administrations. And I've written a little bit about this in The Atlantic and other places, but the way I put it is like everything becomes the Twitter files, where you have these very decontextualized emails, documents, things that, again, are not quite what these online crowds decide that they are, but it's advantageous to the administration that wants to do a thing anyway, and now they look even more responsive to the public, and so you have this kind of novel exclusionary populism that is able to seem even more responsive to the public, and the public feels engaged, and the cycle perpetuates and persists. So institutions struggle to adapt. Now, the institutions are, in the US, when we talk about institutions, I used to mean that more as government. I think a lot of that now, a lot of the struggling to adapt is actually the NGOs and the people on the outside who are not necessarily, who oftentimes serve as like a counterforce to the federal government or sometimes a complement to the federal government. They too do not really know what to do here. This is the part where I'll very briefly touch on what's happening in academia. If I can click the slide. There we go. All right. So in June of 2023, or March of 2023, the guys who wrote the Twitter files sat under oath in the Weaponization Committee hearing, and it was Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger, and they began to make these like wild allegations that Stanford Internet Observatory's effort to study the 2020 election, so the Election Integrity Partnership that I mentioned, had not studied it, but in fact had managed to censor 22 million tweets. That is a staggering number. People would have noticed that when it happened, but these are not necessarily the most informed people, and so they got that number from a guy named Mike Benz, who ran a thing called the Foundation for Freedom Online, which was just a blog, but it had the name Foundation in the name, and so he was all of a sudden the executive director of his blog, right? And so what happens is the executive director for the Foundation for Freedom Online wrote a blog post, and Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger cited it under oath to Congress. And all of a sudden the next day, Jim Jordan sent Stanford a letter saying, "We understand you've been colluding with the Biden censorship regime to censor tens of millions of tweets, and we are going to investigate you." And that is how easy it is. That is all the pretext you need to launch a congressional investigation, where for 2 years, because the committee was only in existence for 2 years, the Weaponization Committee. All of our emails and work product were turned over to the committee. 150 students, undergraduate students primarily, worked on that project. Their emails and everything that they worked on were turned over. We were pressed, they escalated the request for documents to a subpoena quite quickly, actually, because we were redacting the names of the students, because it turns out that we knew Jim Jordan was going to just leak and dump all of this stuff. And it turns out when that happens, you get massively harassed on the internet, again, by these groups of people who think that they are like seeing evidence of the secret cabal machine, even when the documents that you turn over show that all in, we looked at about 2,700 tweets during that period, and Twitter ignored 65% of the things that we flagged to them. So again, we're talking about approximately, so we sent in the course of our research looking at viral tweets that violated Twitter's election policies. When we engaged with Twitter, we engaged in about 2,700 tweets. These guys said 22 million, several orders of magnitude off here. But Jim Jordan never walked that back, right? Just to be clear, it's like McCarthyism. You can never exonerate yourself with your own documents because they have decided what story they want to tell before that subpoena lands in your box. And that's what you really have to understand if you're an academic who gets one of these letters in the United States, right? Doesn't matter though, Stanford decided to wrap the project and kill the center anyway. We did get sued by Stephen Miller. That litigation is ongoing. I spend a couple hours a week rereading old emails, as discovery. I can't talk about that case because it is active litigation. Similarly, another group called New Civil Liberties Alliance sued us, again, the same thing, alleging that we mass targeted and censored various people as de facto agents of the United States government, which is not a phrase that has any legal meaning whatsoever. But nonetheless, they can keep these legal farces going for years because that is how the American justice system works. It is very, very slow going. And after, I think the last stat released publicly was Stanford had spent about $4 million by the end of 2024 on this defense. So Stanford did continue and is continuing to do the legal defense, but one of the challenges is that you can fight legally, but if you're not participating in the public conversation, in the court of public opinion, the narrative about you is written even as you are told to shut up and say nothing. And that is what happened in this situation. And so Stanford Comms largely chose to no comment on essentially every media story about this. So even though the idea that we censored 22 million tweets was so stupid that the appropriate response should have been proactive ridicule, it instead chose to say nothing. And those of us who were named personally in these lawsuits, myself, Alex Stamos, Kate Starbird, a number of us really wanted to respond in the tone and tenor of the internet, because that is how you fight these fights today. And we were unfortunately quite strongly discouraged from doing so. I did a couple things. I dumped, for example, my email exchanges with one of the Twitter Files guys, Michael Schellenberger. I put them all out on Substack so people could see quite transparently that I had been a source for him as he was doing his Twitter Files research, trying to help him contextualize the things that he was seeing, and trying to show that this is what I said to him versus this is what he wrote about me in his lunatic congressional testimony, which was under oath, And I wanted to have that out there so that people could see it and so that it was searchable and so that people who were interested in the story could have access to that information. But these are the sorts of things that unfortunately make institutional comms very, very uncomfortable. So the difference between how you engage in the age of the internet and how you push back against smear campaigns versus how very, very old crisis comms entities want you to push back is an immense gulf, unfortunately. And that was, I think, the cautionary tale of Stanford Internet Observatory. So it shut down the program, and we left. And then you'll notice the date on this. It is from last week, right? So unfortunately, the attacks have begun again. Jim Jordan just sent a new letter requesting information this time. Now again, I didn't attend this meeting. I'm not at Stanford anymore. I haven't been for over a year now. Obama-linked Stanford Center held secret meeting with foreign governments to plot global internet censorship. Again, same guy, Michael Schellenberger, right? And what you're seeing there is Obama-linked means Obama once gave a talk there, okay? And held secret meeting means there was a conference and they had a dinner after it, right? And the dinner was open to a smaller group of people than the conference. And to plot global internet censorship, as far as I can tell from the meeting agenda, was they were talking about the Australian e-safety commissioner was in town, and they were talking about some of the age gating and various other policies that Australia has implemented, many of which I think are bad personally, and I imagine some of the other attendees also think are bad. But that doesn't matter, because this is the headline that you can write, right? And is it objectively false and defamatory? Well, I mean, they write around it very, very carefully, and this is unfortunately what it looks like. And there again, you see, there's the letter from Jim Jordan saying, I didn't post the whole thing, but you can go look at it, it's online now, saying we expect you to turn over all of your emails because Stanford is colluding with foreign governments to censor American speech. And that's the direction that it's going. So even though they chose to shut down the Internet Observatory in hopes that if they did not do the election research, now they are going for other entities within Stanford, demanding their documents and their engagements with Europeans and with Australians and with other tech policy entities outside of the United States, alleging that it is all part of a vast censorship cabal. And so the process continues, right? Because again, all you have to do is make an allegation, and then because Congress has the subpoena power, it can demand your documents, and the circus will begin again. Click. There we go. Meanwhile, this time around, the ranking Democrat member on the committee, that's the Judiciary Committee this time, weaponization doesn't exist anymore, but the Judiciary Committee now, Representative Jamie Raskin, is really trying to do his part to dispel some of this from his position, because the Democrats now have realized that just allowing these narratives to go and go and go, as they did under weaponization, is also quite bad, because they take hold, and when there is nothing out there to counter them, they are shaping public opinion in some pretty unexpected ways. So you are starting to see now minority members of the committee leaking excerpts from transcripts that disprove the allegations that the majority is making, trying to say there's no there, this is a propaganda campaign, this isn't real, this isn't happening. But again, it is increasingly viewed through the lens of, do you believe this side or that side? Do you believe this politician or that politician, this media or that media? And that's where we are. So, now what? So we live in different worlds divided by ideology, identity, or algorithmic influence. And I think that, how do you, responding to this, communicating in an age of discord and distrust requires very different types of engagement. I think the three things that, three quick takeaways. One, we're not going to fact check our way out of this. And this was my frustration just from a personal experience now. 2 years, we talked during the Q&A about the narratives that they created about me being like a secret CIA agent placed in my job at Stanford. You can't fact check that away. It's not misinformation. There's no, you can only say so many times, like, guys, this is bullshit. It's just not true. It's just not a problem of facts anymore. It's so much deeper. It's so much more about identity and trust. And as much as I wish it was misinformation, and if only we could get more facts to the people, like, that's just not what this actually is about. So communicators have to really adapt to fractured and contentious reality. And I think that communicators is a very big word, because I think that I've also recently have a white paper that just came out with Carnegie arguing that people in institutions need to be communicators now also, right? Need to be putting themselves out there quite a bit more and engaging much more with the public, significantly more directly. And recognizing that when you are talking to people, different groups of people are going to hear that message in very, very different ways. So understanding what that means, either from an institutional perspective, your university's comms department, when you are writing a paper, how your things are going to be interpreted, when you are tweeting or posting or doing anything public, even the video of this talk, the fractured and contentious realities piece is very, very real. And then the last piece is institutions must adapt to power now moving through networks. I think for a very long time, there was a lot of belief. I remember hearing it from the CDC. Those were just some people online. People will continue to trust us because we have the authoritative information. That's just not true. The power of networked communication, the power of what people see in front of them, how it's framed for them, the receptivity that comes from something coming from a member of your community, it is foundationally different. And I think that it is critically important that institutions understand understand that top-down model of posting a thing and engaging through mass media, that's just not how trusted information moves. That's just not how public opinion is shaped. So understanding much more how to engage in the influencer algorithm crowd ecosystem is absolutely critical. And as much as I don't necessarily think it's academic work, it is work that I spend a fair bit of time on these days, just coming out of my own experiences over the last 2 years. So I think it is now a matter of understanding how attention works, building capacity for networked response, right? I am really encouraged by the networked responses that I see coming out of public health. I think now the voices that are beginning to emerge, like epidemiologist influencers, medical influencers, that is really the field that I think, funny enough, over the last 10 years has really gets it now and is just like out there, really experimenting and doing things. We can talk about that maybe during the Q&A also. But building that capacity and like actively being out there, experimenting, network building, figuring out how do you amplify your colleagues' messages? How do you get good information out there to the public? It is so much this networked response capacity. You have to be able to participate in that virality loop, and that involves amplification. And then finally, protecting the integrity of decision-making from viral manipulation. That's a long way of saying making sure that you're not being overly reactive to the kinds of stuff that, the kinds of attacks that happen online. Right? Whether that's policy at an institutional level, meaning the online rumor all of a sudden leading to the transformation of a policy or the gutting of an institution, or shutting down a center or terminating research because of an online rumor or attack. And that's the book, if you're interested. My website, just reneediresta.com, has various details and stuff about me and work and where I am on socials and things. And then, yeah, I guess we'll get to talking.
Yes, thank you so much for indeed a very engaging and very distressing talk. I really enjoyed it, but I was also it remains a very scary space, obviously. I have a number of comments and questions, and I've organized them in four. So the first question is about power dynamics that we see online now. In a way, it seems like the same as a reproduction of what we see offline in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of like who gets most visibility, who's most liked, shared, who goes viral, and so on. But they seem to be younger. Could you say something about the composition, the background of the people who have most power in this space? I was also thinking, a friend of mine, Laurel Weldon, wrote a book years ago entitled From Protest to Policy. And Laurel studies the women's movement, and her argument is that, like from protesting and mobilization, eventually, like it will become policy, and it shows how important social movements are. And if I got it right, you said from post to policy. Yeah. So I was like, wow, this is where we are at now, right? That you post as much as possible, and then at some point it becomes policy. So this is really the new way of mobilizing, and it also shows to me like how intertwined the online and the offline world are, and we really cannot see and study them anymore as separate entities. My second question is about countering. How can we counter this? You said something about this at the end, and my impression was that that your recommendation is to go into that space, to counter it within that space. And I think, like, is that at all possible? How do you do that? And I was thinking about Audre Lorde. You cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. I mean, are their narratives powerful enough? Are we interesting enough to do this, to go viral as well? So this is one question, and the other one is about regulation. So with my team, we study hate, violence against feminists, against gender, and so on. And although there is a lot of hate and misogyny and so on, it is very difficult to detect because it is either taken down or it's very implicit. But if you put them all together, it's very harmful.
Right.
So, which also makes it very difficult to regulate. I was wondering how US-based is your story? The material you presented obviously is on the US, but could you say a little bit more about the transnational reach and also to the global South, for instance? I mean, the examples you gave, you said, like, have you heard of it? Yes, it all comes to us and our algorithms, but maybe you can say a little bit more about the rest of the world. And then one issue I'm personally very concerned about as a PI and as someone who's leading a group with early career scholars is the ethics of self-care in studying these kinds of things. So on the one hand, there is obviously your own security and safety. I mean, you got sued. I mean, that is really terrifying, I think. So how do you protect yourself and your team the best way possible? And how do you manage self-care for you and your team? So one of the things I realized only when we were already in a project, one on Twitter, on anti-gender and anti-feminist movements, and one ethnography on TikTok and Instagram and so on, is what it does to the researchers. So I realized that one of the postdocs was doing the research on their own devices, which meant that the algorithms came back in the free time. I mean, and then obviously you learn from these kind of things, and you think, okay, we don't do this kind of stuff on the same devices that you also use for other ends. But also, like that after a day of going through these harmful and hateful and misogynist messages, that it takes a toll on their mental health. So this is something that we are working on to see how can we best organize this care for ourselves when doing this kind of research.
You ended with, I think, the darkest, the bleakest part of it all, this dismantling of the Stanford Internet Observatory, which is really, really terrible. Attacking and harassing of scholars working on this, and it's not just that it happened in this case. There are lots of other scholars. It's now coming over to Europe as well. The Digital Services Act and all these kind of things, disinformation research being seen as censorship. So I mean, if we cannot study these things anymore, then I think we're truly lost. So that's, I think, an important topic for us here all in this room. It's academic freedom and how to preserve it, how to protect the ivory tower. Because if we don't find evidence for these things, if we don't understand these dynamics that you have presented here, we will never get to any point with regulation, because you can't really regulate anything you don't understand and you don't have really empirical evidence about. So for me, that's really the darkest of many dark stories that you present in the book. So let's talk about your lecture and the book. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you for writing this. I can only recommend it to anyone. It's very accessible. It's a very nice summary of, I think, 15 plus years of research on these topics. Also from communication science, there's a lot of very active field of scholars in political communication, journalism, and beyond working on this. And I very much liked and was impressed that in your book and also in your lecture today, you clearly go beyond this misinformation, disinformation thing, because clearly what's at stake here is the larger epistemic order, a lot of larger questions. So Michael Hameleris is here today, for instance, who's been publishing a lot of super interesting things about this here in Amsterdam. So this is about power, it's about the structures, it's not just blaming the platforms for not properly doing their job, but it's about the business models behind it and the incentives that they provide for a whole bunch of actors. So I think it's very accessible, it's brilliant for students who are just kind of getting into this field, but also for everyone who's, we're easing into the holiday season, right? So if you're coming home and then they're all asking, so what do you do all day, and why is everyone crazy now, and can you answer this question for me? So instead of discussing it for the entire holidays, just give them this book, and it's very accessible, and they will understand what's going on. I have two things I would like to that I found particularly interesting. One of this is participatory propaganda, the memeability of it all, and this connection of, or the role of fun in it, right?
Yes.
So it's not just people see false stories on the internet, it's some random people on the internet, but it's also a lot of fun. Propaganda, disinformation, harassing people, doing really dark things is something that gives pleasure to a lot of people online, and also to people in power, and that's the part that I find interesting. So couldn't we also think about these stories and these examples you've been presenting us as a problem, a lack of accountability? And you said something remarkable. You said the difference to the left side of politics is the left elites are not sharing this, they're not participating in this participatory propaganda. When Donald Trump or J.D. Vance are pushing this forward, it's not just a problem of some influencers on the internet. No. And we've just seen this in the Netherlands with the election campaigns that just concluded last week with the elections, where two members of parliament used generative AI, started a Facebook account, and it was the most visible Facebook account with most reach, more than any other parties, where they anonymously churned out AI-generated stuff on political parties, on politicians. And you really wonder, where's the accountability in that if political elites, people in power participate in that? So isn't it just, isn't the problem here accountability more so than the technology? And the other thing relates to what Liza already brought up, regulation. Invisible rulers, how invisible is this still, and how do we get out of this? Clearly not fact-checking. That was perhaps, I'm not saying that fact-checkers are not doing their job, but it's clearly not enough. There are some interesting ways ahead in terms of regulation. I just learned from a student of mine when I gave a lecture and explained influencers and journalists and what's the difference, that in France they have interesting laws for influencers. So as soon as they start doing commercial partnerships, regulation kicks in, right? So if you want to make money with this, you need to register. There is regulation. You have to be responsible for this. So they did it for stopping some scammers and people promoting snake oil and these kind of things. But it could also be a good model for getting some accountability back into political content. We have the Digital Services Act in Europe and beyond. It's just has to be on European topics, but we have a legal right now as scholars to access at least some sort of data. It's so hard to study this stuff, right? So what are your thoughts on that? Are we better equipped now to study this? Is regulation, or what kind of regulation could get us out of this?
The regulation question is so interesting because you all see it so differently here, right? So we don't have much in the way of regulation in the US. We have very, very, very different views on the intersection with online speech and hate speech is protected under the First Amendment, so that definition actually makes Americans quite uncomfortable. You see this reflected in Jim Jordan has visited Europe several times, I don't know if you know this, to fight about the Digital Services Act. We have held hearings. We had Nigel Farage actually come and testify in front of the US Congress about censorship in America. So the dynamic is pretty remarkable on that front, I think. And I write, I'm also a contributor to a publication called Lawfare, where I write about online speech quite a bit. And I think this question, one of the reasons why I advocate more participation, this touches on a question that you asked me also, is that in the US, it has become quite clear that content moderation does not work the way people want it to, right? And that there is significant backlash that is caused by moderation. We knew this going into COVID, right? I wrote about this, actually, we had this project called the Virality Project, and if you read the Virality Project report, it starts off by saying that taking this stuff down doesn't work. And so the intent of this project is actually to try to help counter speakers in public health understand what they need to respond to in as short a time as possible. And we really kind of explained then, of course, what we found was that there weren't very many counter speakers. There wasn't very much in the way of an institutional response capacity. There was no entity that was tasked with participating in the public conversation in any meaningful way to do any kind of countering. So do you have to do it? I think you do. Is there a 10-year gap and backlog? Yes, there absolutely is, which is why I also write quite a bit these days about how funders need to be investing in that. Maybe controversially, I say that it's actually funding the response in some ways is absolutely critical, that I think that there are things where we do understand the pathways, and when we get to that point about who does the response, like that's where the funding ends, because they're afraid of being seen as being political in bolstering a movement of counter speech, because unfortunately this is now seen as you're sort of countering the populist right, which is, I think, unfortunately a short-sighted way to see it. I think it should be seen much more in terms of like, how do you have evidentiary-based communication engage differently in the public square? But that's sort of where we are. This also speaks to the power of platforms, which is that what we have seen in the US is a significant walk back of certain policies in the US that they have not walked back in Europe. Number one among these is fact-checking, actually, where the movement to community notes models, which I support and I think are generally quite wonderful because they enjoy a far higher degree of legitimacy, unfortunately, than media-based fact-checking does. I think that there is opportunity for these things to be integrated, but I do think community notes is a positive and worthwhile thing to continue to develop. You give a whole talk on, it's actually one of my research areas at Georgetown, like the various areas in which they fall short, but I think that they do enjoy high legitimacy. What's interesting, though, is that even as Zuckerberg and others tout this as a positive in their reports under the DSA, they have chosen to kill it in the United States because of how politicized fact-checking has become on the right in the US, which has reframed fact-checking, which is more speech, as censorship. So censorship has become essentially that mental stop word where the minute they say it, it's a thought-terminating cliche, and even if it makes no sense, that propaganda campaign has been extraordinarily effective, extraordinarily powerful, and that's why they call the DSA the Digital Censorship Act, actually. And you are seeing that begin to migrate over here in the engagement with European leaders as well. It doesn't mean that I think that the DSA is uniformly wonderful, but I think that there are things like the ability for users to appeal, the ability for researchers to request data access. There's a lot of very positive things about it. Requesting data access in the United States was also reframed as censorship. Transparency is censorship. And transparency is censorship because they don't like the thought that like the woke academics are going to be the ones getting the data, and that's how that was reframed. So it is a little bit, and to speak to power, that's because most of the people, and I lay this out a little bit more clearly in some academic papers that should be coming out soon. Most of the people who led the initiatives here, including Jim Jordan, were election deniers, right? And so the people who most benefited from the Stop the Steal movement, from the the sort of rumor mill, who saw what we were doing at Stanford in responding, addressing, countering, and mitigating it, people who saw that as the most inconvenient to their political movement, who, when they achieved political power, immediately set about crushing the efforts that had been the most inconvenient to them in amassing that political power in the first place. And that is what is actually happening here. And I think that that also gets a little bit lost, the extent to which political power intersects with platform power these days. And you see that in the form also of letters, conciliatory letters that YouTube and Meta have been sending to Jim Jordan, and to and like lawsuits that are being settled with the Trump administration, which are really being done to be conciliatory and to be and to ingratiate with power, because they are afraid of regulation and they are afraid of their executives continuing to be hauled in front of Congress and and I hesitate to say held accountable, more blamed in certain ways for things that they actually did not do by the administration.
I have a question. In the EU chat control legislation and other legislation that would have people submit their IDs or verify their age and their identity has been proposed, and different platforms are implementing it. Would this change any of these dynamics, or no, because people already post propaganda with like their full name, address, and a picture of their kids in their profile as well?
I don't think it has as much of an impact, because per the point, you maybe see a reshuffling of who wants to do it anonymously versus who doesn't. I think there is actually a legitimate fear that ID-based participation on social media platforms will have a significant chilling effect on dissident speech. That's the area that I think is actually quite significantly costly, particularly when the ID credential is tied to a government. There's also some work being done on, can you have privacy protecting ID credentials that recognize that fraud and abuse, even beyond social media bots, disturbing the discourse. I'm talking more about actual overt scams and things that are also beginning to take shape, particularly as generative AI enables identity theft in some very, very easy ways. You're starting to see questions about, are there ways to do privacy protecting credentials or behavioral based signals that allow for some of that identity protection without having to tie your social media participation to a state-issued credential. You do have to think about that question of what happens if an administration shifts in Europe as well, where you don't want the government knowing who you are on a platform, and so that's the trade-off that comes with that. So are there ways to do anonymous credentialing where you're indicating that you're real and that you're not an automaton? That I think is valuable. But I don't think that it would have necessarily the impact that people hope.
Oh, difficult choice. I'm going to go for the younger generation.
Thank you. Also, to add to that, if I may, we also see this in the UK with the age verification, right? Where essentially, for example, if you go on a porn site, really big one, you would have to give your full ID. So instead, kids who want to access this stuff anyways,
go to Belarus.
They go to something that has lower usage rates with a lot worse content. My question, since you're facing a lawsuit, right, and you said, oh, you can't fact check away the people who are suing me, I was wondering, in terms of social movement research, right, we also saw a big campaign against Black Lives Matter. If you can't fact check people away saying, oh, you're violent black men who are rioting in the streets, how do you deal with that? Or also with the outlawing or the criminalization of the Antifa?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So in an actual courtroom, you can fact check to at least some extent, right? They have to, when you're actually, it's very interesting watching how this shakes out. It takes an incredibly long time sometimes, but they do eventually have to prove that we were de facto agents of the government, which is, they can't, which is why they just keep dragging it on. But for things like this, I think that question of how are you positioning yourself? Like, what are you putting out there about yourself? What are you putting out there about your movement? How are you explaining who you are and what you are, so that when people go looking for information, that's what they find? This is why when I said there's a difference between fighting in the court of law where you can file all the amicus briefs, and we were filing amicus briefs in the Murphy v. Missouri case and some of the cases that were moving through the U.S. courts on this topic earlier than ours, right? Or more publicly, more visibly. They went all the way up to the Supreme Court. I was actually there for oral arguments, which was very cool. But when you watch these things, there's a difference between like somebody having to go have like a Westlaw account and like go to a law library to find the facts, or things being locked in some PDF somewhere in some filing, versus here as frequently and often as possible, I'm going to make this as SEO friendly as possible, or I'm going to make sure that the AI answer engine knows the truth about this, because otherwise, like, what is Grok going to return? What is Gemini going to return? What is ChatGPT going to return? It's weird to think about it, but I think that actually, I think academia doesn't think in those terms right now. Stuff that sits behind a paywall in a journal, stuff that sits in Westlaw and a legal filing, that's not accessible to the public. If you have to be like logging into your university library to get to it, the public can't find it. And media is not going to be covering these like essentially non-events. Like the latest, foray in a lawsuit is not something that media is going to cover unless it's a massive case. So what are you putting out there about yourself? Like you have to be constantly thinking in terms of what am I making available? How can I make sure that people understand the truth of the matter? Honestly, another thing, this is why Wikipedia is now the subject of a ref working war. It's because that is another place where people go when they want to find information about these things. And oftentimes it is edited by like small groups of people who are incredibly passionate about an issue, rather than people who necessarily have some information, or they wrote a paper about it, or they know something about it, but they don't consider it necessarily worth their time to be engaging in that consensus shaping environment. And so again, they're producing maybe the primary source, but they're not engaging in the public discourse.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Connecting to academia is not thinking about
Very
this.
brief because the drinks are waiting for us.
Okay, going beyond regulation. So I was reading some reviews of your book, and they're all like, phew, that's a great diagnosis, but where do we go from now?
Yeah.
One of the more interesting was from Dave Karp from George Washington University, and he writes, if there's reason for hope right now, it rests on the sheer instability of our present media and political systems. The center cannot hold. I don't know what comes next, but I'm rather certain it will not be simply more of the same. We have room to work towards something better. Would you say our information systems are broken beyond repair? Should we think about how to fix them, or should we think about how to build something better, something new?
I love that question. I spend a lot of time at Georgetown on that question. So I'm working on a project building a recommender for Blue Sky, not because we want it to be specific to Blue Sky, but because there's a phenomenon in sort of social media design research called bridging-based ranking, where you can actually amplify certain types of content that diverse populations find generally agreeable, just to reduce that down in its simplest form, right? So both the right and the left feel that this article on abortion is reasonably fair, right? Maybe that's the kind of content that you surface instead of the highly divisive, factionalist, nut-picking content of like the most inflammatory left or right opinion. You find something that's roughly speaking going to articulate the issue in a way that is palatable-ish to both sides. And this is a really interesting form of design research. We can build it on Blue Sky because it's an open architecture. So I write so much these days, and I actually do it with colleagues on the tech right also, who also see it as a way of facilitating like interoperability, a way of growing a new tech ecosystem that isn't dominated by a handful of players. Little tech is the term for it, where this question of can you facilitate a new marketplace of new entrants through the creation of tools like middleware. All right, so I write a lot about middleware, I write a lot about decentralization. There are trade-offs, and we try to be as clear as possible in what those trade-offs are, particularly in the realm of content moderation. If you get doxed, who handles it in a decentralized system is the sort of canonical example. But I think that there are architectures and algorithmic recommender models and different ways of thinking that can shift the algorithmic incentives in that triangle in material ways that then have downstream impacts on the incentives of the other kind of two legs of the stool, if you will. And yeah, I spend a lot of time on that now. That's one of my big areas.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professors Mugge, Diresta, Klinger, and thank you to you all for coming. So it's my pleasure to invite you for drinks, and please join me in giving applause.
Thank you.